What you see here is 131 Summit Avenue, which is where Richard lived with Uncle Paul and Olof and Buddy until 1928. In 1928, they bought the house next door, which is 127 Summit Avenue, and Olof had a little bit of extra cash when the Moyers didn't, and he was able to buy this rather nice house for a good price. And from 1928 on until the mid-1990s, it was the Larson home. It was the home of Richard and Uncle Paul and Uncle Bob in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then 60s and 70s, it was the home when they were growing up of Stephen, David, and Paul. Two anecdotes stand out in my memory. Number one is, can you get the window up to the left there, second floor? Yep. There was a cat, and I think the cat's nationality was Siamese, and the cat's name may have been Buckabee, I'm not sure. But the cat was a ferocious hunter who the neighbors insisted wear a bell around his neck because it could bring home game birds, bring home rabbits bigger than itself, squirrels. It was a tough cat. One time, legend has it, late at night, the cat was making the sounds that cats make, and the male head of household, oxymoron, opened up the second store window, and it was in January, and there was a huge mound of snow, as is typical in Minnesota, and it was light snow, and by a report, there was a large screeching and meowing as the cat hurtled several feet into the snowbank, and poof, it was quiet all of a sudden. That image is a great image. I love that image. The cat, of course, was fine, hopped off and got to the garage and survived. So that's one anecdote. The other anecdote is that in this 1966 or 67, there was a very famous doctor who made a house call to our house. House calls were vanishing at that time, but this very famous doctor made a house call there. Coincidentally, there was a band concert, and our very well-connected band director, Arne Johnson, knew this fellow, and they were invited to come to the house after the performance. And apparently this doctor was not even a medical doctor, and he's a doctor your parents probably knew well. Your parents probably saw him often late at night. Haha. Doc Severinsen came, and nice guy, was at the party in 1966 or 67 at 127. Moving right along, next door to the 127 Summit is 121 Summit, where most notably Aunt Margaret, quote, the girl next door, lived, along with Eugene, best friend of Richard, and Gordy Smith. Great relationship, great house, great neighborhood. The southern end of the Larson house that points toward the Smith house, again, Aunt Margaret, Jean, and Gordy Smith. It was a great view because you could get the river valley off to the west, and he had a good vision of the Chippewa River as it flowed through Montevideo. This is the Larson building, constructed on Montevideo's Main Street sometime 1910 or thereabouts. The original site was purchased by Ivor in 1888 after the famous blizzard. He came into town to avoid another blizzard and became a merchant. So since 1888, this has been the Larson site. In 1910, this structure was actually built. The top structure was well known to Richard's sons in the 60s and 70s because he would clean out and take care of the rental units he had up there, which were quite something. We were paid the handsome sum of $1 an hour, of which we actually took home 25% because 75% went into the bank, comma, we guess, period. Second floor was actually where the ladies' apparel store was, and again, the famous phrase is since 1888. The bottom story housed the offices, which we will get to in a moment. This site is where the furnace was down beneath the store, rather old furnace that in the late 60s, early 70s, I was busy trying to keep going in the winter months. More on that later. So this is the end office where Olof in the early to mid 60s had an office where he would do some real estate, some bit of work. He passed away in 1967, but in the 60s this was his last place of business. The next office up was the home of Alton Isaacs, Farmers Union Insurance. Nice guy, soft spoken. There was a rather severe and strict enforcer up at the high school, the vice principal. A typical role for the vice principal. He's the tough guy. The principal happened to be Len Brown at the time, and his name was Glenn Shaw. He was a very no-nonsense, strict guy. But an employee of Borg Larson at the travel agency happened to be Glenn Shaw's wife. And once or twice a year in December or January, the furnace, aforementioned, that we pointed to earlier, would go out. And David, myself, would get a phone call, or no, excuse me, would get a summons from the principal over the loudspeaker to report to the vice principal's office, and I would be dispatched to fix the problem out of school with no excuses necessary. The third office up was most notably the Monty Travel Service from about 1968 or so to 1988. This is where Borg and Dick did the right thing at the right time. They got out of the dress business on the second floor and came down here. They founded the Monty Travel Service, which they owned and operated for 20 years. They hired a travel agent out of Minneapolis named Nan Clark to manage the business because they were new to it, and Borg worked as her assistant all those years. And this was the golden age of travel in the 60s and 70s, because travel agents could go anywhere for next to nothing, and they went on fam trips where the airline and the local chambers of commerce would pay for them to go. They would be busy seeing everything, but then they could go home and describe what they saw to the customers who might fly places, and they could speak from personal experience. Borg and Dick went everywhere for next to nothing. It was amazing. I never knew where they were next. In about 1976 or so, Dad was concerned about lack of profit. So he announced to the Nan Clark, the manager, on Friday afternoon that the International Agency of Travel Agents would be coming to inspect the books on Monday. He didn't have to do that, he found out. But shortly thereafter, within an hour, there was a, quote, fire, end quote, period. So the investigation showed that, of course, it was arson set by Nan Clark to cover her tracks. Nan Clark was a very clever and very well-rounded individual who was good at what she did. She had become friends with the county attorney, and Borg and Dick weren't interested in punishment. They just wanted their money back, and the county attorney declined to pursue it. So Nan Clark got lots of money at the expense of the travel agency. At any rate, Borg took over managing the travel agency and did so for the next 14 years or so. And they sold it at just about the right time as they were moving on. Next to that was the Cliff Brown Printing Agency. And Cliff Brown printed here with an old-fashioned printer for decades and decades. He actually printed some flyers for the rock band that I managed in the late 60s. For free, by the way. He misspelled psychedelic, but that's okay. My grandfather, Olof, was busy doing lots of stuff in addition to being president of the local cooperative. What do I want to say here? Savings loan. Yes, savings loan. And the analogy with It's a Wonderful Life and Potter, the banker Potter, is not exact, but essentially my grandfather operated this as not quite in sound business practices as they would have liked. There wasn't much of a profit generated. So the directors, when grandfather Olof was hospitalized or something, they met down in this building down, in this office down here, to decide the fate of what should be done. Richard, my father Richard, got wind of this meeting And the building is rather labyrinthine and with dark corners and crevices everywhere. So Father Richard enabled himself to get back there and listen through a wall to the meeting, got it verbatim through a crack, and eavesdropped, I guess you'd call it, and knew exactly what was happening before it happened. So, little story there in Montevideo, Main Street. Main Street, Montevideo, facing toward the railroad tracks. It has over the years undergone transformation. Big box stores and the internet caused this to be very much depressed. And that's the Larson building from the front. In the 80s and 90s, Main Street was a ghost town. There used to be 2 shoe stores, at least 2 men's apparel shops, 2 men's apparels, and 3 or more ladies apparel shops, men's fashions, a number of. Main Street was full diversity. The typical Courier and Ives, Main Street, United States, USA, full of shops ready to sell you things. For 25 years it became kind of a ghost town with essentially junk shops and used things and lots of CPAs and lawyers and things. Now there's a bit of a resurgence, but big box stores and the internet spelled the demise of what I, in the 60s and 70s, I was used to bustling activity, Christmas cheer and decorations, and it's making a modest comeback, though it's not totally recovered. The Monte Travel Service relocated under new management to this actual Main Street address. I don't know how it's doing. Next to that is the Montevideo Publishing Company, home of the Montevideo American. Borg was city council president and on the police commission when there was a bit of controversy about successorship for the chief of police. It was a huge dividing issue in the city, and there was, we'll just say, acrimony. Richard, actually became part of the police commission too, and Stephen and David waged a fairly successful, actually victorious, letter writing campaign calling attention to the inconsistencies and obvious lack of objectivity of the newspaper as being a power in town without any sort of thing to oppose it except for Stephen and David. And A, we were right. B, they were messing with Borg, our mother. Big mistake, Monte Publishing, big mistake. Over the years, a number of individuals have been members of the Gay 90s Quartet. This is my favorite of all. There's Uncle Bob to the left. Eugene Smith is there too. Father Richard, of course, and Bill Johnson. These individuals went, as you heard before in the previous cassette tapes, have been all over singing. I think the total was 37 states in the United States, 2 tours to the Far East during the Vietnam War, entertaining troops in hospitals. One of the anecdotes during that trip was that Uncle Bob, there was a section of wounded warriors. This is probably 1969 or something like that. A section of wounded warriors, and they were predominantly African American. And Bob was the only one who could get away with this, because Bob was Bob. He was a character of the First Order, and he edged to the edge of the platform and looked down into this African American concentration. He said, "Gee, it's awfully dark down there," or words to that effect. It cut up the audience. They roared. And Bob was a great hit, and he was Bob. I forgot to mention, this still hangs in the Montevideo Public Library on Main Street. It's been here for years and years and years. And during testimony to the best ambassadors Montevideo ever had throughout the United States. And the Montevideo Public Library, this is where the portrait of the Gay 90s is housed. This is the house directly up the hill from the travel agency and the Larson building. It was in the Larson name for years. Clara Larson lived there. Most notably, it was called the House of Doom by Stephen, David, and Paul because Richard's sons would work there, of course, for the legendary $1 an hour back in the 60s, of which we got 25 cents, and 75 cents went to, we guess, the bank for college. We have no idea. So we would spend lots of time cleaning up after transient residents there, and it was an old house. And now it actually has, if you can look in the middle there, it has a big swimming pool in the backyard and a nice new garage. This place that used to be kind of run down. And Ivor passed away there in 1929 at the age of 80 something. So that was part of the Larson domain. This is the model B-17 that Uncle Paul constructed somewhere 20 to 30 years ago or so, and gave it as a gift to Richard in commemoration of his flying as a bombardier on a B-17 in World War II. 16 missions conducted.
17.
17 missions conducted, sorry. 17 missions conducted over enemy targets in 1944, 1945. DFC for tossing 19 100-pound bombs out of a bomb bay door because they were jammed. And if he couldn't get the bombs out, you can't return to base with a full load of bombs because you get in big trouble. So he had to drop them manually out of the bomb bay door at minus a whole bunch of degrees, and the story goes on. And that B-17's been hanging in Dad's establishment for the last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Well done, Uncle Paul. This is Larson Park, named for Olof for all of his civic efforts. Richard hardly ever knew his father growing up because it was the Depression, the 20s and 30s, and his father, Olof, was always busy working, early hours, late hours throughout the day, plus heavily involved in civic activities. So Larson Park is named for Olof, but essentially it captures the whole essence of small town America, in my opinion, because Buddy, Olaf's wife, was heavily involved in musicals. Anything with music or drama presentation had Buddy's name on it because she was a community leader when it came to involvement. Her sons grew up rich in the tradition of music and harmony throughout the decades. Succeeding them in their efforts were Richard. He sang in the cantata for the church often and represented Montevideo throughout the United States as goodwill ambassador of the Gay 90s Quartet, the manager. Borg was very active in civic events, hospital board, city council, blood drives, and so was Dad to the extent possible. So this sign captures what I consider to be the essence of Olof and Buddy and Richard and Borg throughout the decades in Montevideo.